I want to welcome everyone who is busy signing on and has already joined us. My name is Dr. Amy Krappel. For those of you who don't know me, I am the director at the University of Florida's Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. Our center is housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and is a multidisciplinary area and language studies center. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our discussion today is recorded and it will be available on the UFCES website shortly. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation. Participants can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and we encourage you to use this rather than the chat function. It helps us to manage questions. We want to thank you for joining us today to discuss crisis decision-making, how COVID-19 has changed the working methods of the EU institutions. This is the final talk in our Jean Monnet Chair webinar series, Pandemics in Europe, Political and Social Responses. If you'd like to see the previous talks in the series, and I think there were 6 of them, you can again go to our webpage and our YouTube channel. That's ces.ufl.edu, and you can find the links there. We want to, of course, thank in particular the European Commission's Erasmus Plus program for its support of this webinar series. All disclaimers apply. Our speakers today are Sophia Russack and Drew Fenner. Sophia is a researcher in the Institutions Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies. Her main research interests lie in the fields of EU institutional architecture, decision-making processes, and institutional reform, with a particular focus on the European Commission. In addition to her responsibilities at CEPS, Sophia is completing her PhD research at Maastricht University, where she is investigating the institutional balance between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union in various modes of differentiated European integration. Drew Fenner is a 4th-year student of political science and European Union studies here at the University of Florida, and a former research intern in Institutions Unit at CEPS. His research interests focus on EU interinstitutional relations, particularly in the context of agenda setting and interinstitutional balance. Currently, Drew is conducting research for his honors thesis that evaluates the European Parliament's informal influence in the field of EU foreign affairs. And I suppose there should be a disclaimer to the effect that I am Drew's advisor on that project. With that, I will hand the discussion over to Sophia and Drew. At the end of the talk, I'd like to remind everyone that there is an event survey, and we ask and request kindly that participants fill out this survey as they are leaving the talk. And with no further ado, I hand it over to Sophia, I believe.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks for the kind introduction and welcome to everyone. Thanks for all your interest in the work that Drew and I have been doing. Last summer, we have published the paper in August. And well, we have written this paper together while Drew was interning with us at CEPS in Brussels. Unfortunately, this was a remote internship, but we had a great work together and we published this paper. And well, I will hand over right away to Drew, who will kick us off.
So yeah, like Sophia said, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time and attention today. Sophia and I are going to be talking about, like she noted, something that we co-authored together this summer. And really what we were looking at is how did the pandemic affect how decisions were taken within and then also between the EU institutions. So just to begin, we'll go over a bit of a roadmap. I'll introduce our research question a little bit more, the data that we gathered and how we went about writing the paper. And then Sophia will cover the nature of the type of decision-making that really went on this summer. It's important to note that the time period that we address was from May until July. So this was very much so still in times of a first wave when chatter of a second wave maybe started at the end of the summer. From there, we're going to be addressing each institution in particular. We'll discuss what the usual decision-making procedures look like, and then we'll move on to the crisis procedures. And then after that, we'll deliver what our concluding remarks are, touching on some of an institutional comparison, but also outlooks for the future in terms of institutional modernization and readiness. So for our research question, we were concerned with how did COVID-19 containment measures, so this includes travel restrictions as well as social distancing, how did these measures affect EU decision-making procedures? To kind of gather this data, besides having a deep dive into each institution's rules of procedure, we also conducted a handful of expert interviews with senior EU officials. And these were from individuals from the Secretariat General of the Commission and the Parliament, also the DGs and a couple cabinets in the Commission, as well as 2 MEPs, and then speaking from a member of President Michel's cabinet and also President von der Leyen's cabinet. So again, just to reiterate the structure and the logic that we'll be presenting by, we're going to cover how decisions are usually made, how they're made in Corona times, and then see were the institutions equipped and able to adapt.
Exactly. So when we look at the nature of Corona decision making, let's call it that way, we have to differentiate, of course, between crisis-related legislation and regular legislation. And when we look at the regular legislation, then we can say that the pandemic has, had kind of a good timing in the sense that it hit right in the beginning of the legislative cycle, where naturally not so many files are on the table. Things were scheduled according to the Commission work program, and they were continued to work on, but in a slower pace. And when we then look at the decision making in concrete crisis response, then we of course see that the EU lacks competences in most fields that relate to the crisis, such as health policy. And that means that what the EU could legislate on was, of course, quite limited. And that means that EU action was largely non-legislative and coordinative. So we saw a lot of information exchange and guidance plans, for instance, the tourism and transport package that the Commission came out with. Some legislation was adopted, mainly in the economic field, but also a good example in this is the suspension of airport slot requirements, because here we can see how fast things can go if they have to go. I mean, as most of you know, the legislative process in the EU takes quite some time, on average 18 months from a Commission proposal until adoption. And here we learned that if things have to go fast, they do, because this file was processed in only 1 month. And how was this possible? Of course, the Commission internal procedures were much quicker. I'll say about this a few words later. And also the co-legislator, the Council and the Parliament, had so much time pressure that there was very little there was much resistance. It didn't allow for much resistance, politically speaking. So we can say, when we look at the legislative process, then the usual business, so non-corona files, was slower and to a large extent put on the back burner, whereas corona measures, legislative measures, were pushed through much faster. And nonetheless, most action was non-legislative.
Right. So now we'll go into talking about the Parliament. A quick disclaimer, the way that we approach the Parliament is a tad different than the Commission and Council, whereas in the Commission and Council, we really focus on kind of what the technical aspects of the decision shaping and making procedures are. For the Parliament, we focus on more so what are the functions of the different components and decision-making methods. So when addressing usual procedures, we start at the work of committees. Committees are, if you're viewing from a perspective of what is an intra-institutional coordinative body, the committee definitely sculpts the agenda of the plenary. So this means that all legislative and non-legislative reports are text. Before they can be introduced into plenary, they're first drafted in the committee itself. And then we also know that the plenary plays an important role for the Parliament's function of democratic oversight, putting questions to the Council and Commission. But before that reaches the plenary, those draft questions are first submitted in the committee itself. So we can really view this structure as shaping what the agenda is. And last thing to note is that each committee is headed by a chair, and that chair exerts a strong gatekeeping role. Then with the work of plenaries, although kind of alluded to how committees feed into that work, the plenary is when the EP will actually adopt its official institutional stances. So whether that's adopting a legislative file or issuing a non-legislative or political report like a resolution. Also during the plenary, there is a function of debate. There's set time for debate, but there's also kind of ad hoc measures such as the catch the eye and blue card procedure that allow MEPs to interject and put questions to each other or make speeches to the floor. And then of course, this is when the commission and council will be present to answer questions. Lastly, to talk about the decision-making methods, typically there are 4 within the parliament. The first is show of hands. Show of hands is also the most common. Then there's the electronic voting system. This system is usually used when the show of hands vote does not produce a definitive result. And then roll call vote. Roll call vote records the position of each MEP and their name. So unlike the electronic system that just records the total number of votes, RCV can actually trace each vote to an MEP. And it's any salient issue really is going to be voted on using roll call vote. And then secret ballot, and that's used mainly in times of confirmation.
Coming to the crisis procedure. So what has changed now that the pandemic hit? I'll also run through the different levels. When we look at the committees, we see that they immediately shifted into hybrid versions. So this means that there were MEPs present in the room and the rest was virtually joining on screen. And by the way, they still are. So a majority of MEPs are still participating in the committee meetings remotely. The biggest issue has been the translation service. And this has really hampered the work of the parliament for quite some weeks in the very beginning, now talking about March last year and April, but it has been solved. And then the translation service was offered quite quickly into 9 languages and then became operational again. So the committees were able to perform their main task quite quickly again, which is, as Drew said, draft resolutions, vote on amendments, and convene hearings. And also we took, we compared a little bit how many meetings took place in 2020 and 2015. We chose 2015 to have a similar point in time of the policy cycle. And we saw that, in terms of numbers, the meeting were just a little less actually. However, the meetings were shorter, about half of the time. And that comes, the reason for this is the translation service. Much is to discretion to the committee chair, as Drew also just said already, even more so in this crisis time, as there was, so little things regulated and many things had to happen ad hoc. So therefore, the chair had quite a powerful position to decide, for instance, as to, how often and if committee meetings take place. And we see here also quite a difference. It's some committees met much more often than others. Coming to the plenaries, so the EP was actually one of the first parliaments in the EU that changed the format, also hybrid, in March 2020, so pretty exactly a year ago. The first plenary was moved from Strasbourg to Brussels. And the parliament also, ever since, hasn't been back in full capacity in Strasbourg and is still meeting every month in Brussels. What has changed? The most significant change was reduced frequency and duration. So we had less days per sitting and we had less hours per day. And we can draw like 4 consequences from that. A, we see that there's less debate among the MEPs, less exchange. The blue card procedure, the catch the eye procedure was suspended. And also only MEPs who are actually present in the hemicycle can speak, unlike in the committees. But however, we also must, a little disclaimer, we know that the debate in the parliament even more so, but also in the committees, the quality of the debate is generally quite low, as it's more a sequence of speeches really than true exchange. So second point is that there was a strong focus, not past tense, there is a strong focus in voting, simply because it takes much more time. The voting procedure has removed to remote voting, and that is basically voting via email. So what MEPs would do is they would fill their ballot paper, they would scan it in and would send it to the secretariat. And in order to make it safe, MEPs, of course, also have to verify. And this happens via a randomized code sent via SMS. So you see, it is a process which is quite, cumbersome, and that means that the voting is simply just taking much more time. And then this is point 2, and then the third consequence is that the question and answer sessions with representatives of council and commission are much shorter. Representatives of both institutions still appear in plenary and committee, but there are less appearances and, more importantly, less speaking time. But again, the overall debating time is simply much less. And then, of course, also decreased output of what the parliament does. I mean, less time means less file to process. And you see that they have to prioritize which files to process and which to park. Our overall assessment is that the work of the EP has been constrained, of course, as also parliaments on national level had been constrained. But what we need to say is that the parliament had particular challenges here with regard to logistics, because the MEPs live in 3 places. I mean, in Brussels and Strasbourg and in their constituency, and they are scattered around the whole of the EU. And their work has to be translated in 24 different languages. So I'd say there's a particular challenging situation for the European Parliament. After this initial lack of and also trouble with live translation services for video conferences, the EP found quite good procedures, and they were also quite quick to do so in comparison with other parliaments. However, I mean, it is quite sure that the digital mode comes at the cost of the quality and quantity of exchange. This is a nice overview here to visualize what I was just mentioning about the average time that has been spent in these two points in time, so 2020 and 2015 in the time span this Drew mentioned. So you see that the daily sitting went from about a bit over 8 to a bit over 4, and the voting daily went from only a little bit more to almost 3 hours, and the debate went down from 7 hours to 2 hours. So here you can see quite clearly where the focus lies in these hybrid meetings.
So for the commission, we'll break down what the decision preparing procedures are and that structure, and then move to decision making. So the decision preparing refers to the intra-institutional coordination and forming of decisions that are to be taken by the institution and then fed into the interinstitutional process. The structure within the council is a 3-tiered hierarchical structure, and that's composed of 3 different bodies. The first is the working groups and committees, then co-repair, and then the council configurations. So the initial and lowest level is that of the working groups. The working groups are comprised in total 150 highly specialized groups. So they have immense technical expertise. And what they do is when a legislative proposal is sent to the council, it starts at the working party and they conduct both a general review and a line-by-line review. If the working group can reach agreement on a proposal, it's then designated as an A point, and that will be sent to the level of the configurations where decisions are formally adopted, but it will be adopted without decision. If it does not reach agreement, it is then labeled as a B point, and then it's sent to the level of co-repair. Co-repair is comprised of national ambassadors from the member states. It is both technical and political in its composition, and it shoulders a very significant role in the institution itself. So co-repair will only be dealing with B points sent from the working party. And then if co-repair agrees on a file or on a proposal, it's an A point adopted without discussion in the council. If not, it's designated as a B point, and then that's to be decided upon by the council configuration. So we note that the configuration itself will only decide upon either B points coming from co-repair or issues that are too politically sensitive to go to either the working group or co-repair to begin with. Then when we talk about the different decision-making methods, there are 2. So decisions can only be formally adopted at the level of the council. However, there are 2 different voting methods to go by. The first is formal voting, and formal voting is really the standard within the council. It requires a physical meeting to take place due to the requirement of meeting a quorum, and that quorum is a simple majority. And then there is also the written procedure. So whereas formal voting is the standard within the institution, the written procedure is not by any means close to the default standard. Typically, it's triggered in times of urgency. So on any grounds of urgency, if either the commission has put a rather specific deadline to the council that they have to meet fast, or if the council cannot convene to take a decision, they can adopt certain acts by written procedure. However, in order to adopt or in order to trigger the written procedure, it must get unanimous approval. So that means even if the council is deciding on a file that's dealt with by QMV or qualified majority voting, in order to decide on something by QMV, you have to unanimously agree to use the written procedure to do that. So what Sophia and I found there is that a political decision precedes every use of the written procedure, informing why it is rarely used.
Yeah. So, and what have they done in response to crisis? The first thing was that the council has, so the secretary that is, has heavily reduced the agenda. So they focused then much more on the fields that were relevant to the crisis, which mainly affected the working parties, so the lowest level, which have been significantly reduced. Then if you look at the highest political level, the councils, the ministers that meet, all these meetings have immediately been shifted to digital format, and most of them still are. We see that as of September, a few I've come across, for instance, foreign policy council formation, but that met in person. But most of them are still meeting digitally. And of course, I mean, there are major disadvantages coming with this online format for this body, because in the council, it's all about negotiation, and negotiation requires non-verbal communication and, you know, the ability to speak to one another, also in the margins of a meeting, and to break into subgroups and so on. And well, effective negotiation via video conferences is just simply very, very difficult. So the work of the ministers has been quite hampered. And we see this in examples, for instance, the migration pact that had been tabled by the Commission last autumn had not even been touched by the German presidency, because it was clear that, I mean, of course, they also had a very busy agenda. But apart from that, it was very clear that that such a file that had been deadlocked for more than 5 years cannot be solved in a video conference meeting. So this file has been parked. And so we see here how much the work of the ministers is affected. But if you look one level below, then we can see that quite a lot of work, a lot of these disadvantages have been balanced out by COREPA. Then this is really interesting, because COREPA has never stopped meeting in person throughout the whole crisis, and they have been the only formation, the only group that had continuously been meeting throughout every wave and every lockdown. Coming to the decision making, so as Drew just said, if the council doesn't meet in person, it doesn't qualify as a formal meeting. So it doesn't because it doesn't fulfill the quorum. So now, and this is also the reason why there were no formal council conclusions adopted. So when we get written output after this meeting, then it was always only just main takeaways and written out press statements and documents of this sort, but no formal conclusions. So unable to make any decisions, they needed to get a bit creative, and so the decisions were made under the written procedure that Drew just explained to you, which is actually highly unusual, and it has to be, as he said, it has to be triggered usually anonymously. So therefore a derogation of the rules of procedure of the council is needed, so that the written procedure could also be triggered by QMV. And this is still how the council operates until today. Of course, now you can say, I mean, most decisions are made unanimously anyhow, even in the fields in which QMV applies. We see that about 80% of these cases, the council still is searching for or actually finding consensus. But of course, nevertheless, a system needs to be in place to be able to legislate in case that's not the case. So overall performance of the council, we found that the council had been quite rigid, and probably the most rigid of the institution in its internal rules, and needed quite some tricks to adapt to this. But the big asset was COREPA, the ambassadors that are permanently based in Brussels and that did quite some heavy lifting for the council, for the ministers.
So now for the commission, we have a very similar decision-making logic to the council in terms of a three-tiered hierarchy as it pertains to their decision-making, but we'll address that in a moment. We look at the commission and break it down into two separate levels. So the administrative level and then a political level. So the administrative level is composed of the DGs or the directorate generals of the commission. And this is where you can say a proposal or a draft of a proposal is born. And it goes through something called the inter-service consultation. So a proposal is first drafted by a lead DG. So that is the directorate general most concerned or most relevant to the drafting of a proposal. They largely define the character and substance of that proposal. After that first stage, which is very informal, and the lead DG is encouraged to coordinate with other DGs, but there's no enforcement mechanism, and other DGs have no way to really hold that lead DG accountable until that draft proposal enters the inter-service consultation. So in the ISC, that lead DG now is obliged to receive the approval of other quote unquote concerned DGs. So any other DG in a policy area that intersects or overlaps with that of the lead DG. And draft proposal needs unanimous approval. So in this way, we can see that every service in the commission has a de facto veto power over a draft proposal. If a proposal passes through the inter-service consultation, we view it as exiting the administrative level and then entering the political level. And this is where we'll talk about the commission's decision-making structure in their political level. So like the council, it is three-tiered, and the logic of A points and B points continues the same here, so I won't go in and explain that. But the first and initial filter or level is the special chefs, and then it is the hebdo, and then the College of Commissioners. So the special chefs are sectorally responsible policy experts in a commissioner's cabinet. And you can think that these special chefs meetings are really organized in a similar logic to that of different co-repair or council configurations, a sectoral, a functional logic for who participates. So if a file does not reach agreement in the special chefs, it's then sent to the hebdo. The hebdo are the heads of each commissioner's cabinet. They will try to settle the proposal. If they reach it, it's passed at that discussion in the college. If not, it is then decided upon in the college. There are two different decision-making procedures, and these can be used in all levels of the decision-making architecture. But the first is the oral procedure, and that's the most prominent. It certainly is the default setting, and it's used for any issues of moderate to high salience. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It involves an oral discussion. We know that in the commission, voting in terms of like taking a tally of how a member cast a vote, that very rarely happens. Things are decided upon by consensus. So that informs the nature of the oral procedure. Regarding the written procedure, this is certainly more rare. It is used really for issues of routine importance or just minor political significance. And that is going to be in the case that there's no disagreement between services or commissioners.
Yeah, let's have a look at the administrative level. What happened there in the course of the pandemic? So, as Drew just explained, the inter-service consultation. I mean, the purpose is to institutionalize the cross-DG coordination, and of course, this is something that that they want to keep, and something that they don't want to just cut. But things have been speed up. So a fast track inter-service consultation has been introduced to accelerate the coordination at the services level. So usually it takes about 10 days to run through these steps. And this fast track procedure would do this in 24 to 48 hours. So services would only have 1 or 2 days notice to prepare the inter-service consultation. So of course, I mean, none of us works there and can, can see how it really works. But according to our interviews, it seems that no steps are left out, but everything is kind of, squeezed together and, just less time for all those steps in there. And the commission still processes a lot of things in this fast track mode. So if we look at the political level, then the college and the hebdo, so the college and the chefs of the cabinet, they did not meet between March and about June, and then after that they met in person again. Whereas the special chefs, the GRI, the EXCO, and all these other cabinet preparatory bodies, they would continue to meet online, and they also still do. Almost everything, or a big share of decisions, is decided upon according to written procedure, and in crisis time, even more so. I mean, this is just logic. Actually, otherwise, things would have to run through all these bodies. I mean, in the worst case, and meeting in person would take much more time and a minimum of 5 days, whereas in the written procedure, it saves a lot of time because these meetings don't have to be convened. But as said earlier, much of the crisis response is non-legislative. So what we see is what the Commission did is it's taken quite a strong role in coordination, and that is internally and externally. Externally, the Commission did something, or is still doing something quite interesting, which we called Commission Capital Networks. So these are informal video conferences which bring together the Commission, so that is either highest political level or most senior level of the DG, or several DGs, and member states ministries. And they do this on a variety of topics, for instance, on transport or on healthcare. And also these networks are still going on. And it's of course interesting because it's a little bit out of the Commission mandate to sit together directly with member states. And it's a bit of a dangerous terrain for the Commission, seeing that the Council Secretariat was, at least in the first lockdown, not amused to see this happening, but apparently this competence anxiety seemed to have calmed down now, settled down. Also, there were more coordinating efforts internally. For instance, they established a clearinghouse for medical equipment in the Secretariat, in the Secretariat General, which brings together different DGs working on these issues. One more point on the Commission is that there is a very strong presidential approach of crisis management. What von der Leyen did right at the start is she brought together a coronavirus response team, which consists of the 5 commissioners whose policy fields are, naturally close to the crisis and its solutions, and which kind of successively widened itself up because other members of the college would complain that they were not included, so it grew in size until at some point it included all commissioners, and up actually until today, in addition to the Wednesday's college meeting, commissioners would still meet in college formation, or at least everybody is invited for a video conference to discuss the crisis. That sounds all very collegial now, but actually it is not. It is quite clear that the crisis management is super presidential driven and that everything is heavily top down. Assessment, our assessment of the Commission's performance, we find that the internal decision-making procedures are very functional and intact, and we're able to accelerate in this situation. The Commission has the advantage that it has a very strong in-house expertise, and that it is already very advanced, very experienced in coordinating. So it suits the non-legislative nature, most of the Corona decision-making quite well. One more overall point that I would like to make, not on the Commission specifically, but zooming out on all 3 institutions, is that digital trilogues were introduced, because this was also one point why non-legislative files have been paused in the beginning of the first lockdown, because trilogues were needed. For the Corona measures, no trilogues were needed because they were passed just right away. But for the other things, for most of the other things, trilogues are needed. And they couldn't, people could not sit together. So a lot of things were paused. And then they came up with digital trilogues. And a lot of people first said, oh, this is impossible, but actually it was. And now, if not ideal, but it happened at least. And by now they shifted to hybrid formats, at least in some cabinets I've heard that, which is quite interesting because hybrid means that the Commission and the Parliament would be in one room and the Council would be on screen. Yeah. All right, Drew.
Okay, now we're just going to get into what our final section is, and this is an institutional comparison, which institutions were most fit and equipped, and then kind of comparing them vis-a-vis the others. Obviously, Sophia's provided us with a bit of a recap after each of the crisis procedures, so I'll try not to rehash those points, but we see overall that the Commission is undoubtedly the most resilient institution from the summer and even moving forward, while the Council and the EP really struggled. And again, we accredit that to the logistical and communication barriers, the size and also multilingual working environment of both of the co-legislators really hampered them at the beginning of the process, even to the extent that the first few weeks of remote working committees couldn't even meet, and council configurations couldn't even have their legal services understand to make a meeting coherent. So these are obviously clear issues. But then if we try to tie it back to more of an institutional perspective and really look at what are the structural differences that informed the reason why the Commission performed better, and then also how would we then rank the Council and the EP? So we know the Commission's ability to break into smaller formations, to broker both intra and inter-institutional agreements was, really fundamental to their success. Also, what we know is the Council was able to speed up their decisions, but that doesn't mean that they had to take out links from their chain of decision making. All the relevant bodies still participated, though some were remote. Whereas in the case of the Council, the working parties were disbanded and the configurations essentially didn't play much of a role. Coreper burden or shouldered that burden. And then in the EP, left largely paralyzed, right? So we know that this is why the Commission is really in an impressive position. But some other reasons that I guess Sophia and I would say the Commission is the quote unquote winner is because first, because so much of this work was of a coordinative nature, so those that don't fall from the legislative channels, as Sophia noted, the Commission very much so kind of filled the usual role that the Council would fill as an intergovernmental coordinator. And this is because the European Council kind of gave this mandate to the Commission. And because of that, taking that role from the Council, when dealing with non-legislative activity, we know that the Parliament's main stake and authority in the EU institutional system is when it's dealing with the community method, right? So if we are dealing with anything non-legislative, the EP no longer has a stake. So in coordinative work, the Commission's extremely powerful. We talked about resilient structures. And then the third is just from a perspective of agenda setting and institutional balance. For that work that was legislative, we understand the Commission does exercise a monopoly on legislative initiative. And when processes have been sped up so much and the Commission remains highly coherent, but both of the co-legislators are, either functioning at a reduced pace or even paralyzed in some parts, just in terms of the institutional capacity and the manpower and the expertise to churn out decisions, the Commission is privileged. But then there's also the temporal aspect, because we know that the Commission is informing what a draft proposal contains, its content, its character. And when it is forwarding a decision to both the Council and EP, and their hands are tied behind their back, and they only have a matter of days to take care of something, whereas usually they have months. Whereas sure, they have a formal ability to resist, but given the nature of the crisis and the need for very expedited action, that formal ability, it's really practically they're unable to resist. So we can view that inability to resist from the EP and Council's inability to resist as something that really strengthened the role of the Commission in the political system and gave it a much more dominant role. And then just on top of that, to touch on what Sophia said, that there was a huge trend of centralization of power with many of the officials that we spoke to noting that von der Leyen was very much so in the driver's seat. And then Sophia is going to cover our last slide, and then we are excited to take any questions.
That's true. Yeah, so, but important to notice is that when we assess the performance, we don't assess leadership. So we're not cheerleading von der Leyen's Commission here right now. So, but instead it's really about the, let's say institutional DNA, about the structural advantage that that Drew was just explaining. When we wrote this paper, we had the potential, a potential second wave in mind. We thought it could happen, but maybe a bit naively expecting that things would come back to normal soon. Most others did too. The Parliament was already scheduling its next debate for September, which obviously didn't happen. And well, we must say that now the paper is actually scarily still up to date. And looking ahead, there's a few recommendations that we teased out. When it comes to the parliament, then we think that they should keep remote voting for, maternity, paternity, illness, and other reasons for MEPs not being able to be present in the hemisphere. And actually, President Cecily made a little feedback round already among MEPs and asked for feedback, what to do better and how to improve the system and so on. However, our impression from the interviews was that the very conservative, also, administrative lead of the parliament did not seem to be very fond of that idea. When it comes to the council, the rules of procedure should be revised to, be a bit more flexible for next time, so that, they don't have to kind of tinker around the way they do to be able to legislate. The Commission should keep these, new discovered technologies, because it was actually quite old-fashioned before. When you want to meet the commissioner, or when somebody from the commission wanted to meet someone, then you either had to go there and you had to have a meeting or a phone call. And now they experience kind of the advantages of everything that lies in between. But most importantly, what we find is that there should be better interinstitutional cooperation and a joint crisis mechanism, because as we see this so often in EU politics, every institution did a little bit their own thing. The Commission, as we explained, had these coordinated networks, and the Council triggered something that is called the EU's Integrated Political Crisis Response Mechanism, EPCR, which you can imagine as something like a crisis Coreper. So it's Coreper 2 ambassadors sitting in there. It's a existing informal discussion mechanism, which has been actually created in the migration crisis. It is called EU Integrated Political and so on, but actually it's very much a council instrument. It reports to the Council and the European Council. It's chaired by the presidency, and it's supported by the General Secretariat. It has been activated by the Croatian presidency during the Corona crisis, but yeah, as far as we can assess, there was hardly any overlap. These different crisis mechanisms of the Council of the Commission was largely disconnected. So now there's always tension between member states and Brussels-based institutions. But I think this became, in the crisis context, became particularly apparent, and therefore we think there would be need for better coordination between the EU institutions, and also a formalization of such coordination. Thanks a lot for your attention. We talked quite a long time now. We're very much looking forward to questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Sophia and Drew. We do have a fair few questions, which means I will hold my tongue because I had a question, but I will first go to our participants and ask for their questions. They're not exactly in order. I'm instead organizing them a bit in terms of topics. So for those who asked an earlier question, just a bit of patience. There's some questions that fit under what I would call the general umbrella of concerns about power distribution, and if I can stretch it just a little bit, even expansion of the perceived democratic deficit, centralization of power, what's been referred to as the authoritarianization of the EU itself in some recent scholarship. So we have one attendee who asks, did the Commission representatives provide any justification for fast-track inter-service consultation? It isn't obvious why this procedure should be expedited. And I would just connect that to another question asking whether von der Leyen's strengthened leadership role was due to the capacity of the Commission services to adapt to these new circumstances, or rather due to the relative inadequacy of the European Council leadership.
I can go ahead and take that first part of the question about why the inter-service consultation was kind of truncated. So the main reason that the ISC had to be expedited, remember when we put focus, this was from May to July, when lockdowns were very intense and a lot of the legislative files up for grabs or being considered. For example, one of them was on different airport slots. We know that airline companies are fundamental to the health of the EU's economy, especially, there's a handful of very important ones. And without introducing that legislation, those companies were hurting very bad. That is just one example to show you that due to the nature of lockdown and its severity, there needed to be action very fast. The regular inter-service consultation is usually at least 10 days, and the inter-service then got down to only 1 or 2. We know that's not the entire decision. That's just the first stage in the administrative process. So in brief, it's because decisions had to be made very fast. I hope that can answer for you.
And Sophia, did you want to take that second one regarding von der Leyen's strengthened leadership role?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think taking a leadership role as an executive institution lies a little bit, in the nature of our crisis. I think this is a trend that we probably would have seen with probably with different presidents. I mean, we have seen how chaotic things are in the coordination with the member states. If it's now also within the institution, if there's no strong hand kind of ruling top down within the institution, it might be that things get even more chaotic. Maybe this was a narrative. I don't know. This is my assumption. But also what I know is that she is new to the office and she is new to the Brussels decision-making scenery. And this is also something that I hear a lot, that this strong leadership style might also be connected to kind of, not really knowing maybe the system well enough, to rely on other parts of the institution and to kind of, to be safe, to let everything run through her own cabinet. This is something that I have come across, this argument.
Okay, now we have 2 questions regarding the EP. Regarding the EP, 2 questions. Any evidence, even anecdotal, that MEPs working remotely have stepped up efforts to cultivate their electoral connection or deepen their engagement with stakeholders outside of the bubble? And another question regarding the EP, commenting really interesting work and thank you, but also noting that one of the things that you folks commented on regarding the lack of EP strength is the scattered membership. But what about MEP assistants and party group secretariats that are more Brussels based? How have they adapted? And was there any possibility for them to shoulder some of the local, meaning Brussels, administrative burden similar to what happened with co-repair?
I can take that second one in terms of what happened to the EP's type of coordinative staff and those assistants. All of those, so parliamentary assistants, any type of advisors, Secretary General, everybody was working remotely. So in that way, I guess you can say they could shoulder more of the burden, but that actually doesn't matter, because what Sophia and I pay attention to is the fact that it's decision-making at the most formal levels in the committee and then in the plenary that are taking the longest amount of time. You see, even just voting took 2.5 times longer than usual. And just the way that those processes were drawn out so much, the restrained capacity of the EP doesn't reflect its coordinative capacity in terms of, or really doesn't reflect the staff of individual MEPs, but really how the committee can meet and what the logistical and geographic barriers are there.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, and on the first question on the MEPs and the electorate or the connection to the electorate, to the constituency, to be honest, I have no idea, and I also don't have any anecdotal stories to share, because it is, to be frank, it is quite it is not so transparent, because there's 700 MEPs now, and I don't know, they spend their time now that they're home office most of the time in different places, and it's very different. Some of them are permanent in Brussels, some of them are clearly put their focus now on their constituencies, so it's difficult for me to say how it is, but I can tell you that the digital dimension, offers quite a lot of opportunity also. And this is not what I mentioned earlier, that about remote voting, so that if MEPs are not present, that they can still participate in the voting, but also it could open up exactly what you say, this connection between the MEP and and its constituency, being more in touch online, or also even the MEPs being more in touch with national MEPs. So I think if we kind of cultivate this digital sphere a little better, then in all kinds of directions, because MEPs have to be in so many different places at the same time, I think this could be very beneficial.
Okay, I have a couple more questions. A question related to the council now, and concerning, and this may not have fit because your data was pretty delineated, but maybe you have some insight as to whether or not the member state holding the presidency made any difference in terms of the operations and power of the council vis-a-vis the EP and the commission. Germany, a big central, well-resourced state, versus Portugal, which is a smaller, less well-resourced, more peripheral state. Were there differences between those two presidencies?
Well, there's certainly differences between the presidency when it comes to institutional balance, where I understand this question is hinting at. I don't know, I can't say that. But the presidency it's too early to assess yet. But I mean, looking at the Germans, they performed quite in a way that they would have expected, in a sense that it had a very tight agenda, that they had massive files on their plate, and that they actually that they worked through them quite well. In the beginning, when the presidency started, we had events about this, and everybody, there was a consensus that this presidency is bound to fail and bound to disappoint, because the expectations are here. But at least this is my sense, that people were actually quite satisfied with what they did. And that, of course, there's always a connection between how professional, how rich the country is, how professional it is, and how much political leeway and also cloud and Angela Merkel still being in office. I mean, all these things were massively important for the German presidency, no question.
Okay, and then we have one last question, pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of politicization here. It is a more recent question, and as the questioner points out, it's something we actually recently had another webinar on. But do you have any sense of the effect that being remote had on the Fidesz drama, the recent EPP Fidesz drama regarding the expulsion of the of Fidesz from, well, the potential and then resigning of Fidesz from the EPP? Just maybe your own opinions. Do you think it might have been different had everybody been in town, had it been a personal process, as opposed to the comfort that being online gives us? This is a tricky question, so do your best.
I can definitely allow Sophia to answer some more specifics, but I can give a bit of a general response here, in which something that we kind of heard as quite a common answer whenever we talk to anybody in any of the institutions, but particularly the council, in how video conference or just remote dynamics were really a hindrance in terms of negotiation, because you have certain features that aren't there. So, back channel features, you have somebody's tone of their eye contact. If somebody asks me a difficult question over Zoom, I'm not pressured because I'm not in a room with them. I can, switch my camera off or have my Wi-Fi drop. So these are actually really important things. And we have a really established member of the General Secretariat of the Council say that most of the pretty nitty-gritty difficult concessions that are made are in between meetings, or when somebody slips a note to the General Secretariat in a meeting, or even just side-by-side negotiation. And we know anyway that informal politics play a massive role in driving EU political development. So I would say it makes dynamics of pressure that typically are responsible for winning concessions, it dampens those or almost eliminates them entirely over a remote format. But maybe Sophia could answer a little more for the particular aspects of that question, but that is certainly a difficult one.
Well, this is of course very hypothetical and difficult to answer. I mean, I think either way, it went very difficult for Fidesz lately, and I think this was an inevitable step to go. Of course, inevitable. Of course, now you can say, you know, not being present, not being pressured, but you know, this can also go two ways, right? I mean, you can misbehave even more if you're not in the presence of the others, you know, or you are, yeah. I mean, I lost my thought. I'm sorry, but I think the Fidesz was going down anyhow, and I don't think that there might be a connection to that.
Okay, since we've answered all the official questions and we have 2 minutes left, I am going to take chair's prerogative and ask you both to just sort of ruminate on my initial framing or question. To what extent do you think this shift to online, virtual, distance, expedited has increased or not the democratic deficit and the distance of decision making at the EU level from citizens overall, or not?
Well, to be honest, I don't really see much of a difference, you know, because EU decision making is already so far away from EU citizens. And, you know, let's take the plenary debates, you know, is any regular, you know, usual citizen watching these debates just for, you know, kind of, you know, for the fun of it, or for, you know, following but we don't belong to that group. You know, we are working on these topics, and we have an interest, a professional interest, and also a private one probably, but most citizens don't have that. So I find, you know, the regular decision making is not followed by citizens, which I, you know, cannot blame anyone, because it's complex, and it's, you know, if people are interested, then it's usually more in their national politics, and, you know, to follow EU politics is really one step ahead, and then it's via the national media, and the national media doesn't report any different right now, right? I mean, the media, if the council meetings, you know, happen online or in person, well, of course, no, that's not true. I have to make another point. It's true in terms of press conferences. There you got a point, that after regular council meetings, of course, the press corps come together and ministers have the chance to explain the meetings and the decisions to the national media. So yeah, there's a point. When it comes to the parliament though, and especially the commission, I don't see much of a difference. The media is a point. With the other institutions, I think that the distance is already quite far.
I think to give a very brief answer on that, you know, if the virtual format has had a worse impact on the democratic deficit, that first, you know, introduces the question: do you buy into a democratic deficit, and which institutions, you know, have what type of legitimacy? But aside from that, whether, you know, let's say you do, or even if you don't, I think just the fact that our core finding is really there has been a shift in the institutional balance in favor of the commission, and the fact that the commission is an appointed body. So if you're looking at it from that lens of democracy, I think, you know, that could certainly be one point.
Okay. Well, we are officially 1 minute over. That's pretty good. I want to thank Drew and Sophia for giving us this really interesting talk, and for all of our audience in attendance. We've had a couple of requests for a link to the paper. We will post a link to the paper when we post the video online, and anyone who was registered for the talk will receive an email when the video is posted online, so you should be able to have access to it then, and usually that doesn't take us very long. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sophia and Drew, and hope you all have a wonderful Tuesday afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are located. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.